The courtroom felt unusually heavy long before anyone understood why. Morning light filtered through tall windows, washing the wooden benches in pale gold. Papers rustled softly. Lawyers exchanged quiet conversations. The clock ticked with slow precision, each second stretching just slightly longer than it should. At the defense table stood a man who did not fidget. He didn't glance around nervously. He didn't shift his weight or whisper to his attorney. He simply waited, calm, still, almost prepared. No one watching him would have guessed that within minutes the entire courtroom would stop moving, and that a single look from the judge would change everything. Before we begin, this is one of those stories that might change how you see people forever. If you enjoy deep emotional storytelling, gently subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut cleanly through the room as Judge Eleanor Hayes entered. She walked with quiet authority, the kind built over years rather than demanded in the moment. Her reputation followed her like an invisible presence, firm, fair, precise. A judge who rarely showed surprise and never allowed emotion to interfere with procedure. She took her seat. The room settled. The clerk read the case number. Routine began. Judge Hayes opened the file before her. Her eyes scanned quickly at first, the way experienced judges process information almost automatically. Then they stopped. A pause so small most people would have missed it, but not entirely. The pen in her hand froze just above the page. Silence stretched a fraction too long. She looked up, directly at the defendant, and didn't look away. "State your name for the record," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, but softer than usual. The man lifted his head slowly. Marcus Vale. The name landed heavily, though no one yet knew why. Judge Hayes inhaled sharply, barely noticeable, but enough. Enough that the defense attorney glanced sideways, enough that the prosecutor shifted uneasily. She leaned forward slightly, studying his face as though searching through years of memory. "You," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The air changed instantly. Judges did not recognize defendants publicly. They did not allow personal history to appear in open court. Yet here it was. "How long has it been?" she asked. The courtroom stilled. 17 years, Marcus replied. A murmur rippled through the gallery before quickly fading. 17 years. Judge Hayes leaned back slowly, absorbing the weight of that number. The young judge she had been 17 years ago felt very far away now. Back then, she had believed every decision could redirect a life. She remembered a teenager standing where Marcus stood now, charged with breaking into a school's computer system, not for theft, for access. He had wanted to learn coding he couldn't afford to study. She had chosen rehabilitation instead of punishment. She had believed she was giving him a future. And now, he was here again. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if we may proceed with the charges..." She raised a hand without breaking eye contact. "One moment." Her voice remained calm, but the authority behind it filled the room. She looked at Marcus again. "You completed the diversion program." "Yes." "You were not supposed to return to this courtroom." "No," he said quietly. "I wasn't." The file rested closed beneath her hand. "What happened?" she asked. The defense attorney shifted. "Your Honor, perhaps we should address the current matter first." "We will," she said. "But context matters." She turned slightly toward the prosecutor. "State the charges." The prosecutor stepped forward. "The defendant is charged with trespassing and unlawful removal of proprietary equipment from Argent Dynamics Corporation." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Argent Dynamics, wealthy, powerful, unforgiving. Judge Hayes's eyes returned to Marcus. "Why were you there?" A long pause followed. Not defiant, not fearful, measured. "I wasn't stealing," Marcus said. The prosecutor exhaled sharply. "You were found removing equipment from the premises." "I was returning it." Whispers rose instantly before the bailiff called for order. Returning it. The narrative shifted again. Judge Hayes leaned forward. "What exactly were you returning?" Marcus hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of truth. "My work." Silence fell like a curtain. "They took it from me years ago," he continued quietly. "Said it was collaboration. But they erased me." The prosecutor objected immediately. "Your Honor, relevance." Overruled. Her tone left no space for argument. The courtroom felt different now. Less like a routine hearing, more like the beginning of something far larger. Judge Hayes removed her glasses slowly and set them down. Recognition had changed everything. Because once someone becomes more than a file, more than a case number, neutrality becomes fragile. She knew she should maintain distance. She knew procedure demanded it. But she also knew this man had once believed she saved him. And now, he stood here again, carrying a story that refused to stay buried. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Vale," she said, voice steady but deeply focused. "Tell this court what really happened at Argent Dynamics." Every person in the room leaned closer without realizing it, because something far greater than a simple charge had just begun. And the truth was about to reshape the entire courtroom. The courtroom remained perfectly still, as if everyone sensed that whatever came next would matter far beyond a single case file. Marcus Vale stood quietly at the defense table, his posture unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted now that he had been asked to speak. The question from Judge Hayes lingered between them, not just professional curiosity, but something deeper, something personal. "Tell this court what really happened at Argent Dynamics." Her voice was steady, but beneath the calm lay a weight only she understood. Marcus took a slow breath. For a moment, he seemed unsure where to begin, like someone trying to compress years of betrayal into words that could survive scrutiny. "I didn't break in to steal anything," he said finally. "I went back because something that belonged to me was still there." The prosecutor stepped forward immediately. "Your Honor, the defendant was discovered carrying restricted equipment valued at—" Judge Hayes raised her hand again, quiet but firm. "Let him finish." The room fell silent once more. Marcus nodded slightly, grateful but not relieved. "They told me it was a partnership," he continued, "years ago, after I finished the program you sent me to." The judge's eyes sharpened. She remembered that program vividly, a mentorship initiative for young offenders with exceptional technical skills. She had fought to get Marcus accepted, believing opportunity could redirect a life. "I started working with them when I was 20, he said. "Argent Dynamics. They recruited me because of my research, said they wanted to invest in innovation." He paused. "They didn't invest. They absorbed." A quiet ripple passed through the gallery. "What do you mean?" the judge asked. "They let me build something," Marcus said. "An algorithm designed to detect vulnerabilities in digital systems, not just security flaws, but patterns that could predict where systems would fail before they did." The prosecutor crossed his arms. "And this relates to the current charges, how?" Marcus ignored him. "They promised equity, recognition, a future." His jaw tightened. "And then one day, my access disappeared. My name disappeared. My work became theirs." The courtroom felt colder. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Did you pursue legal action at the time? Marcus let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but without humor. They buried me in paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, arbitration clauses. I didn't have money for lawyers. They knew that. The defense attorney nodded subtly, confirming the familiar pattern. Power against vulnerability. Control disguised as opportunity. And what happened next? The judge asked. I walked away, Marcus said. Or at least I tried to. He hesitated again, choosing words carefully. But a few months ago, I learned they had repurposed the system I built. For what purpose? She asked. Marcus's gaze flicked briefly toward the gallery, then back to her. Surveillance. The word landed heavily. Not illegal on its face, but dangerous depending on intent. They turned it into something else, he continued. A predictive monitoring system, tracking behavioral patterns, flagging people before they committed crimes, selling it to clients who wanted control more than safety. The prosecutor shifted. These are serious allegations without evidence. Marcus's expression hardened. That's why I went back. The judge's voice softened slightly. To retrieve proof. Yes. Silence followed. She absorbed the weight of his words, the echoes of the boy she once believed she had helped still present beneath the man standing before her. What exactly did you remove from the facility? She asked. A prototype unit containing original data logs, Marcus replied. Records that show the system was mine and how they changed it. And you intended to bring this to whom? She asked. The public, he said simply. A murmur spread across the courtroom. The prosecutor stepped forward sharply. Your Honor, the defendant admits to unauthorized entry and removal of corporate property with intent to distribute proprietary information. Whatever his claims, this is still a criminal act. Judge Hayes remained silent for several seconds. The weight of law and the weight of history collided in that silence. She remembered Marcus at 16, eyes burning with curiosity, convinced that knowledge should be open and accessible. She had believed then that he deserved a chance. Now, she faced the possibility that the system she trusted had shaped him into someone standing against powerful forces alone. Mr. Vale, she said slowly, why did you not pursue this through legal channels now? He hesitated. They've already won every legal battle before it starts, he said quietly. You know how it works. Companies like that don't lose unless someone forces the truth into the open. Her gaze lingered on him. The courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a stage where deeper truths were beginning to surface. And you believed that returning to the facility was the only option, she said. Yes. He paused, then added quietly, I didn't expect to see you again. Something flickered across her face. Not quite emotion, but close enough that the room noticed. The defense attorney spoke carefully. Your Honor, the circumstances surrounding my client's actions suggest potential whistleblower protections that should be considered. The prosecutor objected immediately. There is no formal whistleblower claim filed. This is speculation. Judge Hayes closed the file again, fingertips resting lightly against the cover. She understood the law, but she also understood people and the difference between guilt and motive. The courtroom waited for her decision on how to proceed. Outside, distant traffic hummed faintly, unaware that inside this room, a story decades in the making was unfolding. Finally, she spoke. This court will recess for 15 minutes. Gasps spread softly through the gallery. Unexpected, unusual, but necessary. She stood, gathering her papers slowly, her expression unreadable. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Marcus's again. not as judge and defendant alone, but as two people connected by a decision made 17 years earlier. And both of them understood that whatever came next would test everything they believed about justice. The courtroom doors closed behind Judge Eleanor Hayes with a quiet finality that seemed louder than any gavel strike. For 15 minutes, the room existed without its center. Conversations began in low whispers, rising and falling like waves against the edges of silence. Attorneys leaned toward each other. Observers checked their phones, searching for distractions that didn't exist. But Marcus remained still. He stood exactly where he had been, hands resting lightly on the defense table, gaze unfocused, as though replaying every decision that had led him here. The defense attorney leaned closer. "You didn't tell me everything," she murmured. Marcus gave a faint smile that held no humor. "I told you enough." She exhaled slowly, frustration mixed with concern. This just became much bigger than a trespassing case. "I know." Across the room, the prosecutor whispered into his phone, voice low but urgent. His posture had changed, less confident now, more cautious. The name Argent Dynamics had shifted the gravity of the situation. Everyone felt it. Power had entered the room, even if unseen. When Judge Hayes returned, the courtroom rose again. She sat without speaking immediately, eyes scanning the room with renewed clarity. Something had settled within her during the recess, not resolution, but direction. "Be seated." Her voice carried calm authority, steady enough to quiet every whisper. Before she could continue, the courtroom doors opened once more. Two figures entered, not hurried, not hesitant, deliberate. One wore a tailored gray suit that reflected quiet wealth rather than loud display. The other carried a leather briefcase, posture sharp, eyes already calculating. They moved with the confidence of people accustomed to influence. The prosecutor's expression changed instantly. Recognition, concern. Judge Hayes watched them approach. "Yes?" she asked. The taller of the two stepped forward. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. Daniel Reeves, representing Argent Dynamics." The room seemed to contract around the words. Corporate counsel, arriving unannounced, unusual, strategic. Judge Hayes's gaze hardened slightly. "This is an active proceeding," she said calmly. "State your purpose." Reeves offered a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "We were informed that confidential corporate information may be discussed. Argent Dynamics wishes to assert its interests and requests certain protections regarding proprietary material." Marcus didn't turn around, but the muscles in his shoulders tightened. The defense attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Judge Hayes nodded once. "Yes, it is." She looked back at Reeves. "You may take a seat. I will determine whether your presence is appropriate." He inclined his head, clearly accustomed to negotiation, and sat. The tension in the room deepened. Marcus finally turned slightly, his gaze briefly meeting the corporate lawyer's. No anger, no surprise, only recognition. Like two opposing forces that had been circling each other for years. Judge Hayes folded her hands. "Mr. Vale," she said, "before we proceed further, I need clarity." He nodded. "You claim that Argent Dynamics used your work without credit and altered its purpose. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And that the equipment you removed contains evidence supporting this claim?" "Yes." Reeves stood again. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies these allegations. The defendant is attempting to justify criminal behavior by fabricating grievances." Marcus remained silent. Judge Hayes raised her hand again, stopping the exchange before it could escalate. "I will hear all relevant arguments," she said. Her voice held the quiet authority of someone who refused to be rushed. She turned back to Marcus. "When you entered the facility, were you aware that your actions could result in criminal charges?" "Yes." "Yet you proceeded anyway." "Yes." "Why?" The question lingered. Marcus inhaled slowly. "Because sometimes the only way to prove the truth is to risk being called guilty." The words hung in the air. Even the corporate lawyer paused. Judge Hayes studied him carefully. She had heard many defendants justify their actions before, but something about his certainty felt different. Not desperate, resolved. Reeves spoke again, tone carefully controlled. "Your Honor, regardless of his claims, he trespassed into a secured facility and removed proprietary equipment. The legal facts are straightforward." The defense attorney countered immediately. "The context suggests potential whistleblower protections and questions of intellectual ownership." Reeves's smile returned, thin and precise. "Speculation." Judge Hayes listened without interruption. Her silence forced everyone else to slow down. She turned again toward Marcus. "When you built this system, what was its original purpose?" Marcus hesitated, then answered quietly, "To protect people." The courtroom grew still. It was supposed to detect vulnerabilities before they caused harm, infrastructure failures, cyber threats, things that could save lives. "And how was it changed?" she asked. "It started flagging individuals instead of systems," he said, "predicting behavior instead of preventing disasters." A subtle ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery. Judge Hayes felt a cold realization forming. Predictive monitoring. Surveillance framed as safety. She looked briefly at Reeves. His expression remained calm, but a flicker of tension betrayed him. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "these are exaggerated interpretations of lawful corporate innovation." She said nothing. Instead, she leaned back slightly. The room waited. And then she asked a question that shifted everything. "Mr. Reeves, when did Argent Dynamics first acquire Mr. Vale's work?" He hesitated, only briefly, but enough. "Approximately 15 years ago," he said. The number settled into the air. 17 years since Marcus had stood before her as a teenager. 15 years since his work had been absorbed. The timeline aligned too perfectly. Judge Hayes's eyes sharpened. "Was the original agreement signed while Mr. Vale was under any form of mentorship or rehabilitation program?" Reeves paused again. The hesitation was louder this time. "I would need to review records." Marcus spoke quietly. "I was 20, still in the mentorship program." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hayes felt something shift deep inside her, a realization that reached beyond this case. She had sent him into that program. She had trusted the institutions connected to it. And now she faced the possibility that her decision had indirectly delivered him into the hands of people who would reshape his work without him. The weight of responsibility pressed against her composure. She remained calm. But inside, something changed. She leaned forward slowly. "Mr. Reeves," she said, voice steady but firm, "this court will require full disclosure of any agreements between Argent Dynamics and Mr. Vale related to intellectual property or employment." Reeves's expression tightened. "Your Honor, that is not a request." The room froze. Authority had spoken, and everyone felt the shift. The case was no longer simple. The narrative had expanded beyond trespassing into questions of power, ownership, and truth. Marcus stood silently, watching her. Not with hope. Not yet. But with recognition. The same recognition she had felt earlier. Because the moment that changed everything had just happened. And now the courtroom was moving into territory none of them could control. The courtroom had changed without anyone announcing it. The air felt heavier now, not tense in the loud, dramatic way people expected from courtroom dramas, but dense, like something important was unfolding slowly beneath the surface. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat perfectly still behind the bench, hands folded lightly, her expression calm enough to conceal the complexity of her thoughts. Requests for disclosure were not unusual, but the reaction they had just received was Daniel Reeves, corporate counsel for Argent Dynamics, had hesitated, not openly resistant, not argumentative, just long enough to confirm that something existed worth protecting, and that was enough to shift the balance of the room. Marcus Vale stood quietly at the defense table, watching without speaking. He didn't look relieved. He didn't look victorious. If anything, he looked more tired, as though each step forward forced him to relive something he had spent years trying to forget. Judge Hayes broke the silence. "Mr. Vale," she said, gently but firmly, "you mentioned that the equipment you removed contained original data logs." "Yes. Where is it now?" The question settled heavily. Marcus hesitated, eyes flicking briefly toward his attorney. "It's in police custody," he said finally. "They confiscated everything when I was arrested." The prosecutor nodded. "That is correct, Your Honor. The items are currently secured as evidence." She absorbed this information carefully. Evidence, neutral ground, something tangible that could exist beyond accusation or defense. "Has any forensic analysis been conducted?" she asked. "Not yet," the prosecutor replied. "Given the proprietary nature of the equipment, we were awaiting guidance." Daniel Reeves stood again immediately. "Your Honor, my client strongly requests that no analysis occur without corporate oversight. The materials may contain confidential information unrelated to this defendant." Judge Hayes studied him silently for several seconds. His tone was polite, measured, but beneath it lay urgency. And urgency revealed vulnerability. She turned back to Marcus. "You believe these logs demonstrate ownership?" "They show the original architecture," he said, "before it was altered, before they removed my access." His voice remained steady, but there was something raw beneath the surface now. Not anger exactly, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had fought alone for too long. The defense attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, we request independent forensic examination. If the logs confirm authorship or misuse, it fundamentally alters the context of this case." Reeves responded immediately. "This is an attempt to transform a criminal proceeding into a corporate dispute." Judge Hayes lifted her hand again. Silence returned instantly. Her voice came slowly, deliberately. "This court is not interested in corporate disputes. It is interested in truth." The words landed with quiet force. Outside the windows, clouds shifted across the sky, dimming the light slightly. Inside, time felt suspended. Judge Hayes thought back to 17 years earlier, to the boy standing nervously before her, insisting he had broken into a system only to learn. She remembered the risk she had taken then, choosing mentorship over punishment, believing opportunity could change trajectory. Now she faced the possibility that opportunity had been exploited. The weight of that realization pressed against her, but she refused to let it show. Neutrality remained her responsibility. But neutrality did not mean blindness. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "you indicated the company disputes Mr. Vale's claims." "Absolutely, Your Honor." "Then an independent examination should serve your interests as well." A subtle tightening appeared around his eyes. "We would prefer to provide internal documentation instead." That will not be sufficient. Her tone remained calm but immovable. The courtroom felt the shift again. Authority without aggression, control without raised volume. Marcus watched her closely. He had expected resistance, delay, perhaps even dismissal. But this felt different. Not advocacy, not favoritism, just fairness applied with precision. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, a faint flicker of something like hope crossed his face. Judge Hayes turned toward the prosecutor. The evidence will be transferred to a neutral forensic specialist approved by both parties. Analysis will focus strictly on authorship and system modification history. Reeves began to speak again. Your Honor, she continued without pause, this is necessary to determine context relevant to the charges. Silence followed. Not defiance, not acceptance, just recognition that the direction had been set. Marcus exhaled slowly, tension releasing from his shoulders. But relief did not come, because he knew something no one else in the room yet understood. The logs contained more than proof of ownership. They contained records of how the system had changed, records that could reveal intentions, and intentions had consequences far beyond a courtroom. Judge Hayes noticed the shift in his posture. What else is in those logs, Mr. Vale? The question came softly, almost gently. Marcus hesitated. His gaze dropped briefly to the table before lifting again. Proof that they weren't just changing the system, he said quietly. They were testing it. The room stilled. Testing it how? She asked. He swallowed. On people. The words settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving. The defense attorney turned sharply toward him. Even Daniel Reeves lost his carefully constructed composure for a fraction of a second. What do you mean by that? Judge Hayes asked. Marcus's voice lowered. They ran predictive models using real data sets without consent, tracking behavioral patterns, assigning risk scores. He paused, and some of those people were minors. The silence that followed felt absolute. Judge Hayes felt a cold weight settle in her chest. This was no longer about intellectual property. This was about ethics, about power, about harm. She looked at Reeves again. His expression had shifted from confident control to guarded caution. These allegations are unverified, he said carefully. Yes, she replied. That is why we verify them. The courtroom no longer felt like a simple place of law. It felt like the edge of something larger, something that reached beyond individual actions into systems and consequences. Judge Hayes sat back slowly. Her decision formed not from emotion, but from clarity. This court will proceed with independent analysis immediately. Her voice carried finality. And until that analysis is complete, further arguments regarding intent will remain open. Marcus met her gaze again, and for the first time, the past and present aligned fully between them. 17 years ago, she had believed in second chances. Today, she faced the possibility that the system itself needed judgment. Outside, the cloud shifted again. Light returned to the courtroom, and everyone present sensed that whatever the hidden evidence revealed next would change the case forever. The waiting became its own kind of pressure. Days passed between the hearing and the return to court, but inside the minds of everyone involved, time moved differently. News of the case spread quietly through legal circles first. Whispered conversations about a judge who had recognized a defendant, about a corporation suddenly inserting itself into a routine proceeding, about allegations that hinted at something much larger beneath the surface. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. Every seat was filled. Observers lined the back wall. 2 journalists sat near the aisle, notebooks ready, but faces carefully neutral. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered as she always did, steady, composed. Yet those who watched closely noticed the subtle difference. She carried the weight of anticipation now, aware that whatever emerged today would reshape the direction of the case entirely. All rise. The room stood. She sat. Be seated. Her gaze moved across the courtroom briefly before settling on Marcus Vale. He looked more tired than before, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting restless nights. But he also looked prepared, as though he had already accepted whatever might come. The prosecutor stood first. Your Honor, the independent forensic analysis has been completed. A quiet ripple passed through the room. The defense attorney straightened, fingers tightening around a pen. Daniel Reeves remained composed, but his posture had shifted subtly, shoulders slightly tense, jaw set. Judge Hayes nodded once. Proceed. The prosecutor handed documents to the clerk, who delivered them to the bench. Judge Hayes scanned the report slowly, carefully, refusing to rush, despite the attention pressing against her from all sides. The room waited. Every movement felt amplified. Her eyes paused, returned to a line, then another. She leaned back slightly. Summarize the findings, she said. The forensic specialist, seated near the front, stood. The analysis confirms that the core architecture of the system found on the recovered equipment was originally authored by Marcus Vale. The words landed heavily. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in relief. The defense attorney exhaled quietly. Daniel Reeves's expression remained controlled, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Judge Hayes nodded for the specialist to continue. There is also evidence that significant modifications were made after the original design phase. What kind of modifications? She asked. The specialist hesitated. Behavioral prediction modules were added. These modules were not part of the original architecture. Marcus lowered his gaze. The courtroom grew still. Can you determine who implemented these modifications? The judge asked. Yes, the specialist replied. The changes were introduced by Argent Dynamics' internal development teams. A murmur swept through the gallery before quickly being silenced by the bailiff. Judge Hayes continued reading. In the data logs? She asked. The specialist took a breath. They indicate the system was tested using real-world data sets that appear to include identifiable individuals. The words hung in the air. Were these individuals aware of their inclusion? She asked. We cannot confirm consent from the available records. The tension in the room deepened. Daniel Reeves stood quickly. Your Honor, interpretation of data intent requires broader context. These tests may have been part of lawful research initiatives. Judge Hayes looked up slowly. That may be addressed later. Her voice remained calm but firm. She returned to the report, then paused again. Something new, something unexpected. What is this? She asked quietly. The specialist shifted uncomfortably. That section references internal correspondence embedded in the system logs. Explain. The specialist hesitated before answering. There are archived communications indicating concerns from certain team members regarding ethical boundaries. Some messages reference pressure to accelerate deployment despite unresolved safeguards. The room froze. Marcus stared at the floor. The defense attorney's eyes widened slightly. Judge Hayes felt a cold realization forming. The narrative was changing again. This was no longer simply a dispute over ownership or intent. This was evidence of internal conflict, warnings that may have been ignored. She turned a page slowly, her voice lowered. These communications include references to Mr. Vale. Marcus looked up sharply. What kind of references? She asked. The specialist swallowed. They indicate that some employees believed removing Mr. Vale from the project allowed the system to be repurposed more aggressively. The silence that followed felt absolute. Judge Hayes closed the report gently. For a long moment, she said nothing. The courtroom held its breath. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Reeves, would you like to respond?" He stood, carefully choosing his words. "Your Honor, corporations evolve projects constantly. Internal discussions should not be misinterpreted as wrongdoing." She nodded slightly. "Perhaps." Her gaze shifted back to Marcus. "And yet, the findings confirm authorship and substantial alteration." "Yes," Marcus said quietly. He did not sound vindicated. He sounded tired, like someone who had expected this outcome but knew it would not restore what had been lost. Judge Hayes leaned forward, the weight of her decision pressed against the room. "The context of this case has changed significantly," she said. The prosecutor shifted, uncertain. The defense attorney waited. The gallery remained silent. "This court must now consider whether the defendant's actions were motivated by criminal intent or by an attempt to recover evidence related to potential misconduct." Her voice remained measured, but the impact was undeniable. Marcus met her gaze again, not as a boy seeking second chances, not as a defendant pleading innocence, but as someone standing at the center of a truth neither of them had anticipated fully. Judge Hayes paused, and then asked the question that shifted everything again. "Mr. Vale, is there anything else in those logs that this court should know?" He hesitated, a long breath. "Yes." The room leaned forward collectively. "There's one more file," he said quietly. "What file?" she asked. Marcus swallowed. "It's labeled Judicial Outreach." The name landed like thunder. Judge Hayes felt something cold move through her chest. "What does it contain?" she asked carefully. Marcus held her gaze. "I don't know," he said. "But it includes your name." And in that moment, the entire courtroom froze. The silence that followed Marcus's words felt deeper than anything that had come before. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a courtroom waiting for procedure to continue. It was the kind of silence that arrives when reality shifts suddenly, when everyone present senses that the story has crossed into dangerous territory. Judge Eleanor Hayes remained perfectly still behind the bench. Her posture did not change. Her expression remained composed, but inside, something moved sharply. "My name," she repeated calmly. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor looked stunned. The defense attorney blinked rapidly, clearly recalculating everything she thought she understood about the case. Daniel Reeves' composure cracked for the first time. Not dramatically, but enough. A flicker of alarm crossed his face before he masked it again. Judge Hayes folded her hands together slowly. "Clarify," she said. Marcus swallowed. "When I accessed the system logs, there were archived folders categorized by outreach initiatives. One of them was labeled Judicial Outreach. Inside, I saw references to you." Her voice remained level. "What kind of references?" "I didn't open the full file," he said quietly. "I only saw metadata before security intervened, but your name appeared multiple times." The room felt colder. Judge Hayes took a slow breath. Years on the bench had trained her to remain steady under pressure. But this was different. This was personal, without permission. A sudden collision between her role and something she did not yet understand. She turned toward the forensic specialist. "Was this file identified during your analysis?" The specialist hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why was it not mentioned earlier?" "It was flagged as restricted administrative material unrelated to system authorship. We focused primarily on ownership verification." Her eyes sharpened. "You will describe it now," The specialist glanced briefly toward Daniel Reeves before answering. There is a folder labeled Judicial Outreach Program. It appears to contain internal communications referencing partnerships between Argent Dynamics and various mentorship initiatives connected to court diversion programs. Judge Hayes felt something tighten inside her. 17 years ago. The mentorship program. Marcus, her decision. What kind of partnerships? She asked. The specialist spoke carefully. Correspondence suggests the company sought access to talented individuals identified through rehabilitation or mentorship initiatives. A murmur rippled through the courtroom before fading into stunned silence. Marcus's voice came quietly. They were scouting us, he said. Judge Hayes did not respond immediately. She stared at the report in front of her, but her thoughts had already moved backward through time. She remembered the optimism she had felt when placing young offenders into mentorship programs, believing she was opening doors. Had those doors led somewhere else entirely? Daniel Reeves stood abruptly. Your Honor, this line of questioning is inappropriate. Corporate outreach programs are lawful and often beneficial. Judge Hayes looked up slowly. Then transparency should not concern you. Her tone remained calm, but unyielding. Reeves hesitated. The room felt the shift again, authority asserting itself without force. She turned back to the specialist. Do these files indicate that Argent Dynamics monitored or tracked participants beyond professional recruitment? The specialist hesitated again. We cannot confirm without deeper analysis. Marcus spoke quietly. They tracked us. Reeves turned sharply toward him. That is speculation. Marcus didn't raise his voice. It's pattern recognition, he said. They targeted people like me, young, talented, financially vulnerable, legally constrained by agreements they didn't fully understand. The defense attorney nodded slowly, realization dawning. They recruited through systems of trust, she said softly. Programs designed to help. Judge Hayes felt the weight of that statement settle heavily. Programs she had supported, decisions she had made. She forced herself back into the role she understood best. Neutral, focused, deliberate. This court will not assume wrongdoing without evidence, she said calmly. But neither will it ignore potential relevance. She turned toward the prosecutor. The judicial outreach file will be included in the forensic scope immediately. Reeves stepped forward again. Your Honor, we strongly object. These materials may contain confidential communications with multiple parties unrelated to this case. She met his gaze steadily. Then those unrelated portions will be protected appropriately. Her voice softened slightly, but remained absolute. Truth is not a threat to lawful practice. The room stilled again. Marcus watched her carefully. There was no accusation in his eyes, only something more complicated, recognition, and perhaps concern. Because if her name appeared inside those files, the case had shifted into deeply personal territory for her as well. Judge Hayes felt it too. Not fear, not defensiveness, but responsibility. If the mentorship program had been used as a recruitment funnel without transparency, then her role in sending participants into that environment would need to be examined honestly. And honesty required courage. She straightened slightly. This court will recess briefly while arrangements for expanded analysis are made. The gavel struck softly, but the sound echoed louder than expected. As people began to move, conversations rising quickly in hushed tones, Marcus remained where he was. He looked at her once more before deputies guided him toward the holding area. Their eyes met briefly. Neither spoke, but both understood something had changed irreversibly. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It had become a search for truth that reached into the past, into decisions, systems, and relationships no one had expected to examine. And somewhere inside, a hidden file labeled with her name, answers waited. The courtroom emptied slowly after the recess was called, but the silence it left behind felt louder than the earlier tension. Judge Eleanor Hayes remained seated long after everyone else had stepped away. The bench in front of her no longer felt like a place of distance. It felt like a mirror reflecting decisions she had made years ago. Decisions she had believed were unquestionably right. She removed her glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. Her name. Inside, a corporate system. Inside, files connected to a company now under scrutiny. The thought settled heavily. For decades, she had maintained a clear boundary between her personal conscience and her professional responsibilities. The law required neutrality, and neutrality demanded distance. But now, distance felt fragile. She rose slowly, gathering the forensic report, and walked toward her chambers. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And for the first time since the morning began, she allowed herself to sit without posture, without performance. Just a person alone with questions. 17 years earlier, she had believed deeply in reform. She had been younger then, not inexperienced, but driven by the idea that justice could be more than punishment, that systems could be shaped into something better if people inside them chose courage. The mentorship program had been one of her proudest initiatives. Young individuals with talent but difficult circumstances were paired with organizations offering education, opportunity, and structure. She remembered the meetings, the presentations, the promises made by companies eager to support rehabilitation. Argent Dynamics had been among the most enthusiastic partners. They had spoken about innovation, access, second chances. She remembered thinking they were exactly the kind of institution she wanted to trust. Now, doubt moved quietly through that memory. A knock came at the chamber door. "Enter." Her clerk stepped inside, holding a thin folder. "Your Honor, preliminary details regarding the outreach program file." Judge Hayes accepted it silently. The folder felt heavier than its size suggested. She opened it. The first page contained email correspondence, internal communications between Argent Dynamics executives discussing recruitment pipelines. Her eyes moved slowly across the text, language that felt clinical, detached. High potential candidates identified through judicial mentorship networks. Lower legal leverage risk when contracts executed early. She paused. Legal leverage risk. The phrase felt cold. She continued reading, references to data profiles, background summaries, performance tracking metrics. Her breath slowed as realization deepened. The mentorship program had not simply been a pathway to opportunity. It had been a filtering system. She closed the folder gently, not out of shock, out of control. Emotion could not dictate her response, but clarity demanded acknowledgement. If these documents were accurate, then the trust she had placed in that partnership had consequences she had never intended. And Marcus Vale had been one of those consequences. Back in the courtroom, Marcus sat quietly beside his attorney while deputies monitored the room. He watched people move around him, lawyers whispering, reporters exchanging notes, corporate representatives speaking in low tones. He felt strangely detached from it all. He had not planned for the judge's name to appear. He had not wanted to pull her into this, but truth did not ask permission. The defense attorney leaned closer. "This just became much more complicated," she said softly. "I know. You understand what this means? If her involvement becomes a conflict of interest, she could recuse herself." Marcus nodded slowly. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. Despite everything, He trusted her, not because she had once helped him, because she listened, and listening was rare. Judge Hayes returned to the courtroom after several minutes. Her posture had changed subtly, not weaker, not uncertain, but heavier, as though she carried something invisible with her. "All rise." The room stood again. She sat. "Be seated." Her gaze moved briefly across the audience before settling on Marcus. Professional distance returned to her voice. "This court has reviewed preliminary information regarding the judicial outreach file." Silence fell instantly. "The material suggests that Argent Dynamics participated in recruitment efforts connected to mentorship programs approved by this court." She paused. The room felt suspended between past and present. "As such, my name appears within administrative correspondence related to those programs." A quiet murmur spread before fading again. She continued calmly. "This raises potential concerns regarding impartiality. I have reviewed ethical guidelines carefully." The defense attorney leaned forward slightly. The prosecutor waited. Daniel Reeves remained perfectly still, watching. Judge Hayes took a slow breath. "At this time, I do not believe recusal is necessary." The statement landed firmly. "My involvement appears limited to administrative oversight of mentorship initiatives. There is no indication of personal benefit or direct collaboration with Argent Dynamics." She paused. "However, the existence of these files reinforces the importance of transparency moving forward." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not relief exactly, but steadiness. She was staying. And that meant the process would continue under someone who understood the history, even if that history complicated everything. Daniel Reeves stood. "Your Honor, we respectfully request that discussion of internal corporate outreach practices remain separate from the criminal charges." Judge Hayes met his gaze evenly. "That determination will be made by this court." Her tone remained calm, but it carried finality. She turned toward the forensic specialist again. "The expanded analysis will proceed immediately. Particular attention will be given to any records indicating monitoring or targeting of mentorship participants." Reeves hesitated, clearly weighing whether to object further. He sat instead. The shift felt subtle but significant. For the first time, the corporation appeared reactive rather than controlling. Judge Hayes returned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Vale," she said quietly, "did you know about this outreach program when you first joined Argent Dynamics?" He shook his head. "No." "Did you believe your recruitment was independent?" "Yes." "And when you discovered otherwise?" His voice lowered. "I realized I wasn't chosen because they believed in me. I was chosen because I was easy to control." The words settled heavily across the room. Judge Hayes felt them deeply. Because if they were true, then the system she had helped build had unintentionally created vulnerability rather than protection. She nodded once. "Thank you." Outside, afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Inside, the narrative had shifted again. The judge's past had returned, not as accusation, but as context. And context changed everything. Because now the search for truth was no longer only about Marcus. It was about systems, decisions, trust, and whether justice could still function when history refused to stay hidden. When the courtroom reconvened again, something had shifted in the atmosphere. It was no longer just curiosity driving the audience. It was anticipation, the quiet certainty that whatever came next would move the case beyond ordinary boundaries. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered with the same composed authority she had carried for years, yet those who watched closely sensed deeper focus in her movements now. The discovery of the outreach files had not shaken her outwardly. but it had sharpened her resolve. She sat. "All rise. Be seated." The formalities passed quickly. No one wanted delay. The forensic specialist stood again, a thicker report now in hand. Judge Hayes nodded for him to proceed. "The expanded analysis requested by the court has been completed," he said. His voice carried a careful neutrality, but the tension behind it was impossible to hide. Marcus felt it immediately. The defense attorney leaned forward. Daniel Reeves adjusted his posture, hands clasped tightly together for the first time since he had entered the courtroom. The specialist continued. In addition to confirming authorship and subsequent modifications, the analysis uncovered encrypted data clusters embedded within the system architecture. Judge Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Encrypted by whom?" "We believe by Argent Dynamics' internal teams." Reeves stood immediately. "Your Honor, corporations routinely encrypt proprietary material. That alone indicates nothing improper." The judge lifted a hand, signaling patience. "Continue." The specialist nodded. "These encrypted clusters were not accessible through normal operational pathways. They required elevated administrative privileges beyond standard development access." Marcus felt a cold recognition settle in his chest. He had suspected there were hidden layers, but hearing confirmation made it real. "What did these clusters contain?" Judge Hayes asked. The specialist hesitated, just long enough to deepen the tension in the room. They contained data sets linked to individuals who had participated in mentorship or diversion programs. Silence fell hard. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The defense attorney whispered something under her breath. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Explain clearly." The specialist spoke carefully. "The system appears to have tracked long-term behavioral outcomes of participants recruited through outreach initiatives. This includes career trajectories, online activity patterns, and risk-scoring models." A murmur swept through the gallery before the bailiff called for order. Judge Hayes felt a wave of cold clarity move through her. "They were monitoring participants after recruitment?" "Yes, Your Honor." "For what purpose?" "We cannot definitively determine intent. However, internal annotations suggest predictive modeling." Daniel Reeves rose quickly. "Your Honor, predictive modeling is standard practice in many industries." She looked up slowly. "Sit down, Mr. Reeves." He hesitated, then complied. The shift in authority was unmistakable. Marcus spoke quietly. "They weren't just testing systems," he said. "They were testing people." The words hung in the air. Judge Hayes felt the gravity of that statement settle deeply. She remembered every young person she had guided into those mentorship programs, believing they were being given opportunity. Now the possibility emerged that they had been subjects of observation instead. Her voice remained steady. Was there evidence of consent from these individuals? The specialist shook his head. "We found no explicit consent documentation within the analyzed files." The defense attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, this raises serious ethical and potentially legal issues beyond the scope of this proceeding." The prosecutor nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel Reeves remained seated, face composed but eyes alert, calculating. Judge Hayes turned another page slowly. Her gaze stopped, then returned. "What is this section?" she asked. The specialist stepped closer. "That appears to be a flagged anomaly." "Describe it." "There are entries showing individuals marked as high deviation risk. These individuals were tracked more intensely." The judge's voice lowered. "Was Mr. Vale among them?" A pause. "Yes." Marcus exhaled slowly. Not surprised, just tired. "And were others from the mentorship program similarly categorized?" she asked. "Yes." The realization settled heavily across the courtroom. The mentorship program had not simply been a path forward. It had been a data source. Judge Hayes looked toward Daniel Reeves again. This court requires clarification. Did Argent Dynamics monitor participants recruited through judicial mentorship programs without explicit consent? Reeves rose slowly, choosing each word with care. Your Honor, corporations often analyze aggregated data to improve outcomes. Individual monitoring is a matter of interpretation. Her gaze hardened slightly. This court is not interested in interpretations that avoid clarity. Silence followed. For the first time, Reeves appeared genuinely uncertain. Marcus watched the exchange quietly. He had expected resistance. He had expected denial. But seeing the truth begin to surface publicly felt surreal, like watching a hidden structure collapse piece by piece. Judge Hayes turned back toward the forensic specialist. Was there anything else hidden within these encrypted clusters? The specialist hesitated again. Yes. What? There are internal communications referencing an attempt to remove specific files before legal discovery could occur. The room froze. Even the air felt heavier. Remove them? She repeated. Yes, Your Honor. Were they successfully removed? No. The data remained intact due to a system backup created shortly before the defendant accessed the facility. Marcus looked down. The realization hit him slowly. If he had arrived even hours later, the evidence might have disappeared entirely. Judge Hayes understood it too. The narrative shifted once more. The act that had seemed criminal now carried the possibility of preservation. Not theft, recovery. She sat back slowly, absorbing the weight of everything revealed. Mentorship programs used as recruitment channels. Participants monitored without clear consent. Hidden encrypted files, attempts to erase records. The courtroom no longer felt like a place deciding a single person's fate. It felt like the beginning of accountability. She looked at Marcus again, not with sympathy, not with judgment, with recognition. Because sometimes justice required stepping into uncomfortable truths, even when those truths reach back into one's own past decisions. Her voice remained calm. This court will continue to examine all evidence carefully. But everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted. The evidence they tried to hide had begun to speak. And it was changing everything. The atmosphere inside the courtroom felt different now. Not simply tense, not merely curious. It felt heavy with inevitability, like a moment that had been moving toward this point long before anyone recognized it. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady. The expanded forensic findings rested in front of her, pages filled with technical language that described something far larger than a trespassing case. Around her, the courtroom had grown more crowded. Word had spread. Observers leaned forward in their seats. Legal interns filled the back rows. Reporters watched carefully, sensing a story shifting into something historic. Marcus Vale stood at the defense table, posture calm, but shoulders slightly heavier than before. Each revelation had pulled pieces of his past into the open. Things he had carried alone for years now laid bare before strangers. And yet, he didn't look overwhelmed. He looked resolved. Judge Hayes broke the silence. The court will now address the implications of the newly uncovered evidence. Her voice carried calm authority, not louder than before, but deeper. The forensic analysis suggests that data associated with mentorship program participants was monitored beyond initial recruitment. Additionally, there is evidence indicating attempted removal of files prior to legal discovery. Daniel Reeves stood quickly. Your Honor, My client disputes any interpretation suggesting wrongdoing. Internal data management practices are complex and often misunderstood. She raised a hand. I am aware of complexity, Mr. Reeves. The room fell silent again. What concerns this court, she continued, is not corporate language. It is clarity. She turned slightly toward the prosecutor. The charges before us include trespassing and unlawful removal of property. Those charges must now be evaluated within the context of the evidence preserved by the defendant. The prosecutor shifted, clearly aware that the ground beneath the case was changing. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Mr. Vale, when you entered the facility, did you believe the files were at risk of being destroyed? Marcus hesitated. Yes. What led you to that belief? I received a message from someone inside the company, he said quietly. They told me backups were being purged. The defense attorney looked at him sharply. You didn't mention that before. Marcus nodded slightly. I couldn't prove it without accessing the system. Judge Hayes's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Do you have any record of this message? Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, pausing as deputies watched closely. My phone was returned after processing, he said. The message is there. The defense attorney took the phone carefully and handed it to the clerk. The courtroom waited as the message was reviewed. Judge Hayes read silently. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes sharpened. She handed the phone to the prosecutor. Confirm authenticity, he nodded. It appears genuine, Your Honor. Daniel Reeves stood again. Anonymous messages cannot be taken at face value. Judge Hayes looked at him calmly. They will be evaluated appropriately. Marcus watched quietly as the room shifted again. For years he had felt invisible, dismissed, erased, rewritten by systems too large to challenge. Now, piece by piece, the truth was emerging publicly, not through emotion, through evidence. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, given the new context, the state acknowledges that intent may require re-evaluation. The statement hung in the air. A turning point. Judge Hayes nodded slowly. Explain. The defendant's actions may have been motivated by preservation of evidence rather than personal gain. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Daniel Reeves remained still, eyes focused intensely. The defense attorney spoke next. Your Honor, this fundamentally alters the narrative. My client acted to prevent destruction of material potentially relevant to broader misconduct. Judge Hayes remained silent for several seconds, silence that felt like gravity. She thought of 17 years ago. The young Marcus standing before her, insisting that learning mattered more than rules he did not fully understand. She had believed then that intention mattered. Now, intention returned as the central question again. She turned toward Marcus. When you left the facility with the equipment, what did you plan to do next? Find someone who would listen, he said simply. The honesty in his voice felt unforced. And if no one listened? He paused. I would have tried anyway. The room felt suspended, because everyone present sensed the shift. This was no longer a case about a man accused of theft. It was a case about whether an act technically illegal could carry a different moral weight. Judge Hayes sat back slightly. The court recognizes that significant new factors have emerged, she said. Her voice remained calm, but its impact echoed through the room. These factors require careful consideration regarding both the defendant's intent and the broader context surrounding the preserved evidence. Daniel Reeves stepped forward again, urgency breaking through his composure. Your Honor, I must strongly object to framing my client's actions as misconduct without proper proceedings. She nodded once. And that is precisely why this court proceeds carefully. She paused. Truth is not determined by volume or urgency. The words settled firmly. Marcus felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his arrest, he felt seen not as a problem to solve, but as a person whose actions had meaning. Judge Hayes looked at him again, not as a judge who had once guided him, not as someone connected to the past, but as a professional weighing evidence, honestly. And that mattered more than anything else. She spoke again. This case has reached a turning point. The room grew perfectly still. Before further proceedings continue, this court will consider whether the defendant's actions qualify for legal protections under existing statutes related to preservation of evidence and public interest. Gasps moved quietly through the audience. The narrative had shifted completely. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Not in victory, in relief. Because for the first time, the possibility existed that what he had done might not simply be judged as wrong. It might be understood. Outside the windows, evening light began to fade. Inside, the courtroom stood at the edge of transformation, and everyone present knew that whatever came next would decide not only Marcus Vale's fate, but how justice itself responded when truth arrived from unexpected places. The courtroom felt quieter than it had all day, not empty. Every seat remained filled, but quieter in a deeper way. The restless shifting, whispered conversations and nervous movements had faded into something heavier. Expectation. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat behind the bench, the weight of decision resting invisibly around her. Papers lay neatly aligned in front of her, the forensic report placed carefully at the center. She had read it multiple times. She knew every line, every implication. Outside the windows, evening light softened into gray. Inside, time felt suspended. Marcus Vale stood at the defense table, hands resting lightly against the wood. He looked tired but steady, like someone who had already accepted whatever outcome awaited him. The prosecutor remained standing, posture less rigid than before, eyes occasionally drifting toward the report, as though still adjusting to how much the case had changed. Daniel Reeves sat quietly, composed but alert, his presence a reminder that the consequences of this decision would extend far beyond one courtroom. Judge Hayes looked across the room slowly. Every face carried expectation. She spoke. This court has reviewed the evidence presented, including the independent forensic analysis, testimony regarding system authorship, and newly uncovered information related to corporate practices and potential data monitoring. Her voice remained calm, even measured. The original charges against Mr. Vale concern unlawful entry and removal of property. These charges are serious, and the court does not minimize them. Marcus remained still. She paused briefly before continuing. However, context matters. The words settled into the room with quiet force. Evidence suggests that the defendant acted under the belief that material relevant to potential misconduct was at risk of destruction. The recovered data appears to support that concern. A murmur passed through the audience. Judge Hayes continued. This court must therefore evaluate intent alongside action. She looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Vale, you knowingly violated the law when you entered that facility. Yes, Your Honor, he said quietly. But the law also recognizes situations in which actions, though technically unlawful, serve the purpose of preserving evidence or preventing greater harm. Daniel Reeves shifted in his seat. The prosecutor listened carefully. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. The forensic analysis confirms that critical data would likely have been lost had it not been preserved when it was. Silence filled the space. And based on current findings, that preservation may serve broader public interest. The words carried weight far beyond the case itself. She paused again, allowing the room to absorb the direction of her reasoning. Therefore, she said slowly, this court finds that the defendant's intent significantly mitigates the nature of the offense. Marcus's breath slowed. The defense attorney closed her eyes briefly. Judge Hayes continued. The charges of unlawful removal will be dismissed. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Daniel Reeves stood abruptly. Your Honor, she raised her hand. The court has not finished. He sat again, tension visible now beneath his composed exterior. Judge Hayes turned toward Marcus. The charge of trespassing remains acknowledged. However, given the circumstances and the defendant's prior completion of diversion programs, this court orders time served and no further penalty. The words settled deeply. No dramatic gavel strike followed, just silence. Marcus blinked slowly, absorbing the outcome. Relief did not arrive immediately. It came gradually, like breath returning after being held too long. Judge Hayes continued, her voice steady. This ruling does not determine the outcome of any potential investigations related to Argent Dynamics. Those matters fall outside the scope of this proceeding. Her gaze moved briefly toward Daniel Reeves. But transparency remains essential. She paused. For this court, justice requires balance. Laws exist to maintain order. But fairness requires understanding context when truth emerges through imperfect paths. The room remained completely still. Marcus felt something shift inside him, not victory, not validation, something quieter, recognition. He had expected punishment. Instead, he received acknowledgement, and acknowledgement felt heavier. Judge Hayes gathered her papers slowly. Before standing, she looked at Marcus one final time. 17 years earlier, she had seen potential in a boy standing before her. Today, she saw a man shaped by struggle, by decisions both right and wrong, by a system that had both supported and failed him. She spoke once more. Mr. Vale, this court hopes that whatever comes next for you is guided not only by courage, but by wisdom. Yes, Your Honor, he said softly. The gavel struck gently. Court is adjourned. People began to move slowly, conversations rising into the space where silence had lived moments earlier. Reporters rushed toward exits. Attorneys gathered documents. Observers exchanged stunned looks. Marcus remained still for several seconds before turning toward his attorney, who smiled quietly. Not triumphant, just relieved. Across the room, Daniel Reeves spoke urgently into his phone. Outside the courtroom doors, a new chapter was already beginning. But inside, Judge Hayes paused briefly before leaving the bench. Because even as the case closed, she understood something had changed forever. Not just for Marcus, not just for Argent Dynamics, for herself. Justice, she realized, was not always about choosing between right and wrong. Sometimes it was about recognizing when truth arrives from unexpected places and having the courage to listen. The sound of the gavel faded quickly, but its meaning lingered long after the courtroom emptied. People moved through the aisles in small clusters, voices low but urgent, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile balance that had just been restored. Reporters hurried toward the hallway, already shaping headlines. Attorneys gathered files, exchanging quiet nods that carried more weight than words. Marcus Vale remained where he stood for several seconds after everyone else began leaving. Freedom felt unfamiliar, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just quiet. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of tension in one long breath. His attorney touched his arm gently. "It's over," she said. He nodded, but he knew it wasn't, not completely. Some endings were not conclusions. They were beginnings disguised as relief. Judge Eleanor Hayes stepped into her chambers without speaking to anyone. The door closed behind her, muting the sounds of the courthouse. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to sit without posture, without the invisible armor that came with the bench. She stared at the empty space in front of her, replaying the moments of the trial, the recognition, the files, her name appearing in records she had never known existed, the realization that good intentions could be used in ways she had never imagined. She felt neither regret nor pride, only clarity. 17 years ago, she had believed she could guide people toward better paths. Today, she understood something deeper, that systems were complicated and even well-meaning choices could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. But that did not mean those choices were wrong. It meant vigilance mattered, and listening mattered even more. Outside in the hallway, Marcus paused near the exit doors. The courthouse felt different now, less threatening, less heavy. He remembered standing here as a teenager, uncertain and defensive, convinced the world saw him only as a problem. Back then, Judge Hayes had offered something unexpected: trust. And today, despite everything that had happened between then and now, she had listened again. Not because she remembered him, because she respected truth. That mattered more than anything else. He pushed the doors open and stepped outside. Evening air greeted him, cool and steady. The sky held that quiet moment between day and night when colors softened and the world felt briefly balanced. For a long time, he simply stood there. No cameras, no questions, just silence. Behind him, footsteps approached. He turned. Judge Hayes stood several feet away, no longer elevated behind the bench, simply another person leaving work at the end of a long day. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Professional boundaries still existed, but something else existed too. Shared history. "Mr. Vale," she said gently. "Your Honor." She nodded once. "I hope you understand that today's decision was based solely on the evidence." "I know," he said. He meant it. That was what made it meaningful. She studied him quietly. "You carried a heavy burden alone," she said. He shrugged slightly. "Sometimes that's the only way things move forward." She considered that. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." He wasn't sure how to respond. The idea felt unfamiliar. They stood in silence for another moment. 17 years compressed into a shared understanding neither fully needed to explain. Finally, she spoke again. "When I placed you in that mentorship program, I believed it would open doors." "It did," he said quietly. She looked surprised. "I learned things I never would have learned otherwise," he continued. "Even the hard parts taught me something." She nodded slowly. Sometimes growth came through unexpected paths. Sometimes even through betrayal. A car passed nearby, headlights cutting briefly through the dimming light. The world continued moving. "Whatever happens next," she said, "remember that justice is not a single moment. It's a process." He smiled faintly. "You sound like you're still trying to teach me." She allowed herself a small smile in return. "Some habits remain." They parted without ceremony, no dramatic farewell. Just two people walking in different directions, both changed in ways no one else could fully see. In the weeks that followed, investigations into Argent dynamics expanded quietly. Regulatory agencies began asking questions. Former employees came forward with stories that echoed the patterns uncovered in court. Marcus stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He wasn't interested in headlines. He returned to building, smaller projects, quieter goals, work that aligned more closely with the purpose he had once envisioned. Judge Hayes continued her work on the bench, but something inside her had shifted. She listened more closely now when young defendants spoke. She asked deeper questions, not because she doubted the law, because she understood more clearly how easily truth could hide behind appearances. Some stories end with clear victory, others end with loss. This one ended with something quieter, recognition, not just between judge and defendant, but between past and present, between intention and consequence, between the belief that justice is not perfect, but it is strongest when those within it choose to see clearly. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one moment when someone looks up and truly recognizes the person standing before them.